Luke chapter 12. We're going to be in Luke chapter 12 in just a moment. We'll begin our study, especially in verse 41. We'll reference a few verses leading into that. Luke chapter 12, verse 41. We're going to skip ahead of these announcements and hit those at the very end when we dismiss. Notice this week that the Friday, the 20th, was the 46th anniversary of the plane crash that resulted in several deaths of the Southern rock group Lynyrd Skynyrd. That happened outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, technically in Mississippi, there, the area of Gillsburg. They were flying from Greenville, South Carolina to Baton Rouge, and it was a relatively straightforward investigation in terms of the cause of the crash because the plane ran out of fuel. And the reports indicate that maybe there were some contributing factors such as an engine problem that burned fuel faster than expected, but the pilots, before crashing, knew the plane was low and was essentially empty on fuel. The pilots told the occupants, "We've run out of fuel." They were told to be prepared, to sit down, to buckle their seatbelts. There's a crash that's very likely, and you need to be prepared for that terrible outcome. What's tragic, looking back, there are several people who survived the crash, and some of those who did not survive, who were killed, they did not buckle their belts. So they were thrown from the plane when they crashed. When we think about a tragedy such as this one, especially one that's caused by something like running out of fuel and them having a little bit of a heads up, a warning, this is about to happen. The emotions that we might associate with that, those are not the intended emotions the Lord desires for us to have when we think about His return. There will be much doom and terror when the Lord returns. But again, that's not the intended desire for the Lord as to how we think about Him returning. And as we approach this text of Luke 12, and we think about the fruit of the Spirit, faithfulness, what we find is when Jesus teaches a parable about faithfulness, He does it in the context of His return and some questions that were asked about it. It's in Luke chapter 12 and verse 35, the verse that picks up after our scripture reading for the morning that Brother Ted read. He opens a parable by saying, "Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning." If you were with us last Sunday evening, we talked from 1 Peter chapter 1 about girding up the loins of your mind. Well, this is the same phrase. It's not directly related to the mind here, but it's gird up your loins. Stay dressed for action. There were a way they could wear their garments where they were ready to run, ready to do physical labor, ready to fight. That's the imagery he's bringing to mind. Jesus is telling them a parable to be ready, and he says, you be dressed for action, and you be ready for the master to return back even overnight, any of the watches of the night. So he closes that parable by saying this, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Every time Jesus teaches about His final return, He teaches it in terms of us not knowing when it will happen. There will not be a series of signs so that we can then get ready. Jesus is saying you will not know. Thus, you must always be ready. Now, it's this parable that's found in between these two verses, parable that emphasizes that final verse, verse number 40, that sparks a question by Peter in verse 41, and that's going to set up our text for the morning. Verse 41, Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? Peter's question, I think, is coming from what we might label as, quote, good Peter. You know, Peter we have to kind of be mindful of. Sometimes he's so ambitious, he puts his foot in his mouth. I think this is overall good Peter because he has listened carefully to Jesus when Jesus has said that he often teaches parables to the crowds or even to the critics. They're an attempt to open up their eyes to things that they're missing. And so Peter's wanting to know, is what you've just said about being ready for your return, is that about them or about us? So that's good Peter, recognizing there's a difference in parables, potentially. What I do think Peter is missing, and the reason he's asking this, He's not asking so that he can figure out the exact day the Lord will return and then be ready. What Peter's doing is he's still not yet fully understood what it means to be ready for the Lord's return. That's why he's asking the question. And I think we can know that based on how Jesus answers the question, telling Peter and telling us all what it looks like to live by faithfulness and thus be ready for the Lord's return, no matter when that is. Before we go any further, before we read Jesus' answer, I want us to start on the front end with this and be clear that when it comes to Jesus' words, he makes it abundantly clear how to become his disciple and thus how to know that we are ready and prepared for his return. If we go back and we read the teachings of Jesus, he emphasizes the necessity of believing in him. He says, unless you believe in me, you will die in your sins. John 8 and verse 24. He says, when you acknowledge me before men, he will acknowledge us before the Father in heaven. That's Matthew 10, 32 and 33. That's in the context of persecution. When it's difficult to confess me, when you do that, I confess you before the Father. But then in Luke 13, he addresses some tragedies among the people, similar to what Mark talked about in the Lord's Supper thoughts with 9/11, some things they were familiar with where people suffered. And he says, unless you repent, you'll likewise perish. Just as they died physically, you have spiritual death awaiting if you fail to repent. To follow Jesus, to become his disciple, means we forsake living in sin. We cannot remain in sin and still be a follower of his. As necessary as all of those things are, none of those things save us. He tells us the singular moment at which he saves. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. That's what Jesus says in Mark 16, verse number 16. That's the moment in time in which he does save, in which he causes us to be born again, which we become followers of his. So here's why we bring this up on the front end. If we have not obeyed Jesus Christ in baptism, we're not prepared for his return. We're lost and outside of him, and we would face that day in terror away from him. Likewise, if maybe that is a decision that we have made, if we have begun to live in sin once again, we're not living for him any longer. And we'll see glimpses of that in the parable that follows. But we likewise are not ready for him to return. We're not awake, as the text would say that we've kind of glanced over. We're not ready for the master to come back. And so it's our plea as we move forward this morning, emphasizing faithfulness through this parable that begins in verse 42, that we all take a serious inventory of our soul and our relationship with the Lord, to be sure that we are ready and prepared and awake for his return. As we go into the text, I want us to keep that in mind, but now move further into being more specific with what Jesus teaches us now about faithfulness. Let's reread verse 41 and read the whole text. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom his master will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. And that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. And from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. Just as Jesus is so often prone to do, Peter asks a question, a noble question, a sincere question. Who are you directing that parable to, Jesus? Jesus answers Peter's question with another question. Who then is the faithful and wise manager? It's his lead into this parable. So he's going to eventually directly answer Peter's question, but he's going to do some teaching along the way. And we would do well to learn from that teaching as we study about letting the Lord produce this faithfulness in our lives through our obedience to Him. Let's look at these possibilities. Let's answer Jesus' question. Who is the faithful and wise manager? He gives 4 different glimpses into the lives of servants in the household in this parable. And so let's just think about it, multiple choice, A, B, C, or D. Who's the right answer? And if you were following along, you'll see that it was pretty obvious. He lists the faithful and wise manager first. And so when we answer that question correctly, who is the faithful and wise manager? The answer is found in 43 and 44. He's the doing servant. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Doing, of course, is a verb, and yet it's used like an adjective. Which servant will be blessed at the Lord's return? Well, the doing servant. The one who does what's been assigned for him to do. See, the most important question when it comes to the return of Jesus Christ is not when will it happen. The most important questions are, what am I doing? And who told me to do whatever it is that I'm doing? Blessed is the servant whom the master will find so doing the things which were assigned. If you go back to verse 42, whom his master will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time. So the image is a servant who has servants beneath them to manage them, to take care of the people of his household, and that includes feeding them. So in this instance, the blessed one is the doing one, and what's he doing? He's feeding and taking care of the people of this master's house. Now this is important to notice as we study. He's directly telling this to Peter and the apostles. And they had plenty of ambition. They had left a lot of things to follow him. They were doing some risky things already. He knew they were fired up about following him. But he also knew that they needed to learn to pair that ambition with faithfulness, with prudence and wisdom. To know with a humble, submissive spirit what is truly the will of the master, and then with loyalty to keep on carrying it out. If they're going to be the leaders in his kingdom, they have to have that ambition, yes. But they also have to carry it out with regular, prepared faithfulness and wisdom. And that's contrasted with all the Jewish religious leaders of that first century day. And you just go back and you read through chapter 12, and you see multiple glimpses of how off base they were. He calls them out as hypocrites in the opening verses of the chapter, verse 1. Watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the scribes. They were against God's people. They were the ones who were coming after the innocent Jews. They would be the ones coming after the Christians after the time of the apostles and after the gospel was preached. They are the ones who think that life consists of one's abundance of possessions. So you see that story of the rich fool in this chapter. Well, they were the ones he was correcting because they were living by this sense of self. And they thought they could be prepared not by being rich toward God, but by accumulating all the world's goods. They were the ones who were anxious about the wrong things, what they would eat, what they would wear. And so Jesus is providing a better way, but also now showing these future leaders, you're going to lead with humility and with daily faithfulness and taking care of the people that I've entrusted to you. And this is a common theme throughout Luke, that when you're entrusted with riches, with possessions, the measurement for how you use them is, have you given them to those who are in need? You see that clearly coming out in this parable. Servant set over his household to feed those other servants within the household. Now what's fascinating, if you follow this thread through the lives of the apostles, is Jesus had already begun to show them this part of their responsibility. If you go back to chapter 9, that miracle of the feeding of the multitude, the 5,000 men on the Sea of Galilee, that was clearly a miracle meant to teach them something important about the kingdom. And it's repeated in all 4 gospel accounts, which means that it's highly important. But just to kind of review Luke's account, verse 12 of chapter 9, the day began to wear away. The 12 came and said to him, "Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside and find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place." That sounds noble. Jesus, we've got to take care of the people. But then, very concisely, verse 13, he said to them, "You give them something to eat." Now, he provided the miracle, but he said, "You give them something to eat." He had the apostles to divide them up into the groups on the hillside. He had the apostles to distribute the miraculous giving of the bread and the fish. And that account closes, verse number 17, "And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces." 12 servants served them that day. They sought the kingdom first, and he gave them food to eat following that miracle. So now you see this language coming back in the parable. You've been set over servants to take care of them and feed them when necessary. Remember what happens after the resurrection of Jesus, and he has that heart-to-heart with Peter. "Peter, do you love me?" Jesus tells Peter 3 times to feed his people. So this is very clearly rooted in the role the apostles have in the early days of the church. To nourish, to feed, to equip Christians, and to ensure that the gospel is heard among the lost. I want us to notice, though, quickly how clearly the apostles came to understand this. This is not just a physical feeding thing. When you get to Acts chapter 6, in the early days of the church is doing a good work in feeding the widows. But that work begins to get out of hand because there is a group of widows who are neglected. And it seems possible it was because of their background. They were Greek widows. So the apostles do something about it. But they don't take over the work to physically feed the widows. They ensure that it's taken care of. They let the people choose these 7 qualified men. Why? It's not right that we should go about serving tables. They say we're going to get back to the ministry of prayer and preaching. They took all this teaching that Jesus had given them about feeding people and feeding the sheep and feeding the servants in this parable. And it clicked with them. Oh, we're to feed people spiritually. We're to ensure that they hear the good news about Jesus Christ. That's our role. So when it comes in that Jesus is going to, quote, describe faithfulness to them, what he's doing is showing them your faithfulness will be dictated by whether or not you fully accept your role. The role that you've been assigned in the kingdom. Now we thank God for preserving this for us to see how clearly they understood this responsibility that was given to them. And so what you find in the text of the parable, verse 44, here's the good news. Truly I say to you, he will set him, this doing servant, he will set him over all his possessions. In all these stewardship parables, the theme is the same. When you're faithful over a little, you'll be given much. They had a big task, but it was still, quote, little when compared to the reward that God would give to his servants who fulfilled that role. You also see this theme of blessing woven throughout chapter 12. The doing servant is the blessed servant. He's the faithful and wise servant, and God blesses him as such. So chapter 12 opens, again, we mentioned that hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees, and he makes this point, verse 2, nothing is covered up that will not be revealed or hidden that will not be known. He's first talking there about how he, the Son of God, is going to reveal their hypocrisy, the scribes and the Pharisees' hypocrisy. They've been trying to keep it silent while they portray this public image of being faithful leaders of God's people. He's saying, I'm going to come through, and when they reject me, it'll be clear they're hypocrites. But here's the takeaway. Think about what it is, a blessing it is for the doing servant, for the one who produces faithfulness by walking with God, that what is done in private is still seen as honorable, respectful, and godly. That the person who is truly producing faithfulness has nothing to hide. We produce faithfulness always. And that's the only way in which we can be truly prepared for the Lord's return, is that what's done in private, when it's made known, it's just as valid, it's just as honorable, it's just as godly as anything we might do in public. That's a promise and a blessing that God gives. You fast forward throughout the chapter 12 too, verse 31, seek His kingdom and all these things will be added to you. When you're active and faithful in His kingdom, God provides for your every need. You don't have to go outside of Him. You cannot go outside of Him to have any need met. Very next verse. Fear not, little flock, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Isn't it fascinating that He makes this promise about all these things being added to you? And then He says it's the Father's good pleasure, His good will to give these things to you. And then He pivots from that to go into these parables about His return. His desire is for us to live a satisfied life in Him, bearing His fruit, so that we are grateful and thankful for the last day that we breathe life's air, whether that's the day in which we die or whether that's the day He returns. It's not a day of dread, but it's a day in which we've lived enjoying the pleasure and the goodwill of the Father who's given us all things. But then the blessing in the parable that we kind of glanced over, where He emphasizes His return, it's about the master coming at different watches of the night. The servant who's awake and ready when the master comes back, he's the servant who's blessed. And here's the blessing that comes from that. He will dress himself, the master will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. There's the blessing of companionship and enjoyment that comes from being with God when we are living the doing servant life, when we're living constantly carrying out His will. Now, let's transition to the other three servants somewhat quicker. These are the other options in the parable. It's clear they're not the ones that are blessed. This is why He has to warn us. The next one is the unfaithful servant. He says, here's what happens if, instead of being faithful, the servant does something else. Let's reread verse 45. If that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and in light of that belief, he begins to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect, and an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. Why will he put him with the unfaithful? Because he has very clearly been unfaithful. He's been given a role. He's been given a place of responsibility and a privilege. And instead of doing simply what the master said, he uses that place of privilege, and he uses that role for himself. And he uses it in such a way that abuses and mistreats the people to whom were entrusted to him. I find it fascinating that he first says to himself, my master is delayed in his coming. He has this thought and he begins to believe it. And yet it's not a statement that's true. It's presumptive thinking. It presumes that he knows more about the master's will than the master does. He's holding back something from me, he may think. And so he begins to take things into his own hands. The verb behind begins to beat the servant kind of has to do with leadership. He exercises rule. You almost could hear him say, look at how I took initiative. I did something when my master didn't come back. But what he did, even if he found some way to argue and justify what he did was against the master's will, against the master's very instructions. He wrongly began to assume he was the one who was in charge, not the master who owned the house and the household and the servants. I find it interesting that this is self-talk, and yet it's put against the will of the master. He said to himself, he thought for himself. And oh, how often in our culture and in previous cultures that were against God, that self-talk is heralded as truth just simply because we have the thought. He was elevating experience over the revealed truth that the Master had spoken. Therefore, he began to make wrong and abusive choices because of those misbeliefs. Notice just the levels of his unfaithfulness. It's clear he is dead set against the Master because he physically abuses and attacks the other servants, the male and female servants. He beats them. He then takes the provisions and he eats them and drinks them for himself. He becomes drunk. So he's abusive of the provisions himself. So that's a second layer of unfaithfulness. And then those were supposed to have been used to feed the servants. That's now 3 layers in which he can look, and the Master can look back at him and say, I cannot trust you. You did not trust me. 3 different levels you did not trust me because you didn't do what I said to do. You didn't take care of the people I said to take care of, and you didn't do it with the stuff I left you behind to take care of them with. It's clear this was an abuse of the trust the Master had left behind with the servant. It's a gruesome picture to think about a master cutting up his servant into pieces, casting him out with the unfaithful. But that's where Jesus is spinning this in a spiritual direction for the apostles. There are spiritual consequences if you neglect what I've told you to do. Most clearly, we could see this applying to Judas. Also could see it applying to those Pharisees and scribes, the leaders of the people of God at the time, quote leaders. That's a gruesome picture. And it's a picture we might not be comfortable with when we view it from the perspective of the servant only. But the more we will view it from the perspective of the Master, the more we begin to see just how abusive and manipulative this unfaithful servant was. Think about how quickly we might get riled up or a little off base if we go and we order at a restaurant, a fast food place, and we feel like we're clear about what we want, and we don't get what we want in the bag, or it's made improperly, or the person struggles to give us the right change. How quickly do we get worked up over something as trivial as that? I gave you a job. I asked for your help. I'm paying you, and you don't come through. Now we step out and we look at God's perspective. He's the Master. He's given us a role. And those who misuse that role, those who use that role in a way that's self-serving instead of master-serving, he says that's especially heinous, and I cannot and will not tolerate it. Instead of bearing the fruit of faithfulness, that's bearing unfaithfulness and even wickedness. And notice this is where the Lord's return comes back into play, because he's doing what he wants to do, thinking he has all the time in the world. My master is delayed. That's what he's wrongly believed. So the master comes at a day he did not expect, at an hour he did not know. You can't expect what you don't know. So he thought he was in charge. He thought he could do what he wanted because, hey, my master's not coming back. So we must think soberly about this part of the parable. We've all been given roles. Will we use those roles for ourselves, or will we use them for the glory of God? Quickly, let's notice the last 2. Verse number 47, the wasteful servant. That servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will will receive a severe beating. It's as if he's tying in the previous parable back here to give a wrap up and to finally answer Peter's question. So maybe this is not the servant who beats the other servants, who wastes all of the provisions, but he does waste the knowledge of the master, the knowledge of the master's will. He knows what to do, he just doesn't do it, he's not ready, he doesn't act on it. Well, he's going to receive a severe beating. It's a high bar to know truth, to know the God who's given the truth, and still decide, I'm not going to act on it. I find it fascinating that we don't know why he didn't act. We're not told, here's the reason he didn't obey. I think that ends up helping us, because there's no excuse that he could have made that would justify knowing and yet not doing. So Jesus says the blessed servant is the doing servant. That's as opposed to the not doing servant. That's also opposed to these servants. The planning on doing servant. The waiting to do servant. The thinking about doing servant. The hoping to do servant. The intending to do servant. The once a week servant. The 2 to 3 times a week servant. The reminiscing about past doing. About having done servant. The depending on someone else before doing servant. The blaming someone else for not doing servant. The when I feel like it servant. Jesus' brother, James, would say in his letter, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. This wasteful servant will receive a severe beating, not a blessing. But then there is the ignorant servant in the first part of verse 48. The one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. We would be tempted to look at this and say, well, it's better to have not known. And Peter says that in his letter of 2 Peter. But make no mistake, even not knowing God out of ignorance is not an excuse. Romans 1 makes that clear. He's evident in the things that are made, there's no excuse. What he is saying is that it's best to know. And thus it's best to know and then obey. We should never read a parable like this and think, well, I kind of wish I'd have never heard. Think about what all we would miss out on if we had never heard of the goodness and the love of God. Paul would say the opposite about knowing God. He would say in Romans chapter 11, oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways. It's a blessing to know. We must never grow comfortable with the idea that perhaps, maybe we shouldn't just know. We need to know, and we should want to know the Master's will. And as we're being honest this morning, there are no truly ignorant servants in this room this morning. The other 3 categories, we may all find ourselves in at some point, or we may all be grouped into one of those categories. But we all have known, we all do know the Master's will. The blessed servant, the doing servant, wants to know the will of God and commits to doing it. As we close, let's answer Peter's question and let the Lord answer Peter's question. Because Peter asked about that earlier parable, are you saying this for us or for all? And Jesus gives Peter an answer. It's found in verse 48 that summarizes not only the direct parable, but also the one Peter was asking about. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. That's faithfulness. Taking what you've been given and using it for the glory of God. Taking a role that you've been given and using it for the glory of God. From him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand more. These characters, the one who knew, the wasteful, the one who didn't know, they remind us there are no loopholes. There are no ways out, no cop-outs for the disciples of Jesus Christ. 2 quick principles that summarize how this applies to us every day. If we're going to be prepared for the Lord's return by being faithful every day, 2 key principles. It's defined by the role God gives. You and I are not an apostle, but we also do have roles. And he will judge us based on what he's given us, say the parable of the talents, Matthew 25, Luke 19 with the minas. He will also judge us based on the role we're serving. Did you use that time and opportunity in that role? And connected to that, you cannot separate role from other people. The roles we've been given also connect to other people. There are other people entrusted to you and alongside you depending on the role you're serving. You take any role in life and there are going to be people who are necessarily connected to that role, and thus our faithfulness will be defined by and seen by what we do with those people. When we're faithful to God, the people in our lives to whom we've been entrusted, they'll be benefited. When we're unfaithful to God, those people will have to bear relational consequences because of our unfaithfulness. Because everyone has a role, we all have these expectations to serve and encourage in that role, but also to teach. I think that's a takeaway from this parable. Yes, the apostles' specific job was to teach the gospel. No matter the role, there is a level at which there needs to be some teaching that happens. From parents to kids, you go to Titus 2, you've got older women to younger women. You've got some of those roles that are clearly defined, and we need to be keeping on finding the ways to enlighten one another, the truths that God has given in His Word through Jesus Christ. The role that you and I are in right now, the role that we're going to leave this morning having been judged faithful or not faithful based upon, is the role of a hearer. It's a necessary role, but it's not a sufficient role. James, again, the brother of Jesus, would say, be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Remember, it's the doing servant who's blessed. And so now this morning, you as a hearer, me as a hearer, us as hearers, what will we do now with this opportunity? Will we be doers? That's the question that comes to each of us right now. Will you come as we sing?